They thought I was just another replaceable tech employee. But exactly 14 minutes after being fired on Zoom, their entire $880 million digital empire was locked down, with my own private key. The CEO's smug face from that morning call still burned in my memory as I watched their panic unfold in real time. They'd forgotten the most basic rule of corporate warfare: never betray the architect who built your fortress. My name is Elena Hartman, and at 36, I was the lead systems architect at Neuralink Dynamics, or at least I was until 9:07 a.m. this morning. The Zoom notification popped up on my screen with clinical precision. 3 faces materialized in their respective boxes. Holden Vance, our new CEO who'd swept in 6 months ago with his Harvard MBA and zero understanding of aerospace security systems. Daria from HR, her expression carefully neutral behind designer glasses, and Ethan, Holden's assistant, who couldn't quite hide the smirk playing at his lips. "Let's cut to the chase," Holden said, his voice carrying that particular brand of corporate arrogance I'd grown to despise. "You're no longer with us." I didn't blink, didn't shift in my chair. My hands remained perfectly still on my desk, though my mind was already running calculations. In the background of my home office, the Seattle rain tapped against the window like a countdown. "Your access will be revoked within the hour," Daria added, reading from what was clearly a script. "Please ensure all company property is returned by end of day. Security will escort you if you need to collect personal items from the office." The irony wasn't lost on me. Security. As if I hadn't designed every digital lock, every encrypted pathway, every biometric scanner in that building. As if I hadn't spent 4 years architecting Sentinel Nexus, the $880 million defense-grade security network that protected not just Neuralink Dynamics, but half the aerospace contractors on the West Coast. "Any questions?" Holden asked, already reaching for his mouse to end the call. "No," I said, my voice steady as granite. "Everything's perfectly clear." His eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps expecting tears, anger, or at least a plea for reconsideration. He'd miscalculated, just like he'd miscalculated everything else since arriving at Neuralink Dynamics. The call ended at 9:11 a.m., 4 minutes. That's all the time they'd allocated to dismantling my career. I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself exactly 3 seconds to process the situation. Then I opened my personal notebook, leather-bound, analog, untraceable, and flipped to the page marked Contingency 7. The truth was, I'd seen this coming. The signs had been accumulating like storm clouds for weeks, meetings I was suddenly not invited to, my name mysteriously vanishing from project reports I'd authored. The suspicious request from Ethan last Tuesday for a backup admin key that had set off every alarm in my head. I'd given him a key. Of course. Just not the one he thought he was getting. My fingers traced the notes I'd written in my personal shorthand, a code I developed in college that looked like abstract art to anyone else. Every slight, every suspicious activity, every breadcrumb they'd dropped while thinking I was too focused on my work to notice. The Sentinel Nexus project wasn't just my career achievement, it was my masterpiece. A fusion of quantum encryption, biometric authentication, and adaptive AI that could detect and neutralize threats before they materialized. The Department of Defense had called it revolutionary. The board had called it the future of corporate security. And Holden? Holden had called it an opportunity, not to advance technology or protect classified data, but to cement his position by claiming credit for work he couldn't even comprehend. I closed the notebook and picked up my coffee mug, cold now, forgotten during the call. Outside, Seattle's skyline was disappearing behind a wall of gray mist, as if the city itself was pulling a disappearing act. They thought they were removing a liability, a highly paid engineer who knew too much and challenged too often. They thought they were clearing the path for Holden's simplified vision of success, all profit margins and PowerPoints, no substance or security. They had no idea what they'd just triggered. Because here's what Harvard Business School apparently doesn't teach. When you build a fortress, you should probably keep the architect happy. Otherwise, she might just remember where she left all the keys. The signs of betrayal had been accumulating for 6 weeks, each one meticulously documented in my leather notebook under the heading Pattern Recognition. It started subtly. The weekly architecture review meetings I'd established and led for 3 years, suddenly had scheduling conflicts with my calendar. "So sorry, Elena," Daria would say. "We had to move it last minute." I'd find out later from junior engineers that decisions about my own systems were being made without me in the room. Then came the erasure, the quarterly report on Sentinel Nexus. 47 pages of technical documentation I'd spent 2 weeks perfecting was distributed to the board with one notable change. Where my name should have been as lead architect, it now read Office of the COO, Holden's office. I'd saved the original email chain. Of course, screenshots, timestamps, metadata, all archived on my personal drives. Not out of paranoia, but out of habit. You don't survive 15 years in tech as a woman without learning to document everything. The Tuesday before my termination was when they revealed their hand. Ethan knocked on my office door at 4:47 p.m., laptop in hand, wearing that nervous smile of someone about to ask for something they shouldn't. "Elena, quick favor?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Mr. Vance needs the backup admin key for Sentinel Nexus. For the audit next week." I looked up from my code review, letting the silence stretch just long enough to watch him shift his weight. "The audit's not until next month." "Right. But he wants to do a preliminary review. You know how he is about preparation." I did know. Holden's idea of preparation was usually scrambling at the last minute and then blaming others for the chaos. But this wasn't about preparation. This was a test. "Of course," I said, turning to my secure workstation. "Let me generate a key for him." What I gave Ethan was a masterpiece of deception. To any standard verification, it would appear to be a legitimate admin key. Correct length, proper encryption signature, valid checksums. But embedded in its structure was a tracking mechanism, a digital tripwire that would alert me the moment someone tried to use it for unauthorized access. I labeled it in my notebook as Loyalty Test 3. The first 2 had been smaller, requests for documentation they shouldn't need, access to systems outside their purview. Each time, I'd complied with a smile while laying another thread in my web. 3 days later, the internal newsletter featured a glowing article about Holden Vance's revolutionary security architecture, complete with diagrams I'd drawn and concepts I'd pioneered. My name appeared nowhere in the article. That night, I activated the Orion protocol. I'd built it 2 years ago, after a colleague at my previous company had been similarly erased and left with no recourse. Orion was my insurance policy, a ghost in the machine that monitored for specific conditions: unauthorized access attempts, revoked credentials without proper notice, and most importantly, the use of any honeypot keys I'd distributed. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity. If triggered, it would initiate a cascading lockdown of Sentinel Nexus, requiring biometric authentication from the system's original architect, me, to restore access. Not even a full system wipe could bypass it. I'd embedded it too deeply into the firmware level. I'd never intended to use it. It was meant to be a deterrent, like a nuclear weapon gathering dust in a silo. But as I watched my contributions vanish and my access privileges mysteriously shrink, I realized they were planning to cut me out entirely. The morning of my termination, at 5:23 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert. Someone had used the honeypot key to access the backup servers. The IP traced back to Holden's home network. He wasn't even smart enough to use a VPN. By the time he was smugly delivering my termination over Zoom, the Orion protocol had already begun its work. Every second he spoke, another subsystem was quietly changing its locks. Every dismissive word from Daria, another encryption key was rotating beyond their reach. They thought they were removing an obstacle. They were actually lighting a fuse. I made one final note in my journal that morning. Hubris. 1. Excessive pride or self-confidence. 2. In Greek tragedy, excessive pride toward or defiance of the gods, leading to Nemesis. Nemesis was scheduled to arrive in exactly 14 minutes. The conditions for activation were precise. Surgical. Like a 3-stage trigger on a weapon that couldn't be fired accidentally. Condition 1 had been met at 9:11 a.m., when my access was revoked without the mandatory 30-day notice stipulated in my contract. The system registered the immediate lockout, cross-referenced it with HR protocols, and found the violation. Strike 1. Condition 2 had triggered earlier, at 5:23 a.m., when someone, Holden, based on the IP trace, accessed the backup server using the honeypot admin key. Not just any access, but a deep dive into the core architecture files, the ones containing my original blueprints for Sentinel Nexus. Strike 2. Condition 3 was the killing blow. At 5:24 a.m., the system detected an authentication attempt without biometric verification. The honeypot key had tried to bypass the fingerprint and retinal scan requirements, a clear violation of the security protocols I'd implemented. It was like watching someone try to hotwire a car they didn't realize was protected by a kill switch. Strike 3. The Orion protocol didn't activate immediately. That would have been suspicious, traceable. Instead, it began a calculated countdown, timed to coincide with business hours when the maximum number of users would be accessing the system. Maximum impact, maximum visibility. I sat in my home office, laptop open to a terminal window that displayed the countdown in stark white numbers against a black background. 1347, 1346, 1345. The beauty of Orion wasn't in its destructive capability. I wasn't some vindictive hacker looking to destroy data or cause permanent damage. No. Orion was about control. It would lock down Sentinel Nexus completely, encrypting every access point with keys that only I possessed. But it would preserve everything inside. Like placing an impenetrable glass dome over a city, everyone could see what they'd lost access to, but no one could touch it. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, one of the senior engineers. "Hey, E, your credentials aren't working. Can you check if there's a system issue?" I didn't respond. Marcus was a good engineer, but he'd sat silent in every meeting where my contributions were minimized. Silence was complicity. 1023, 1022, 1021. I pulled up another window, watching the system logs in real time. Every major corporation connected to Sentinel Nexus was running smoothly, oblivious to the lockdown approaching like a digital tsunami. Boeing's encrypted communications, Lockheed's classified project files, 36 smaller contractors, all of them depending on the security infrastructure I'd built. The irony was delicious. Holden had been so eager to claim credit for the system's elegance, its seamless integration, its intuitive design. In approximately 10 minutes, he'd discover that claiming credit and understanding functionality were two very different things. My notebook lay open beside me, filled with 18 months of documentation. Every suspicious request, every altered report, every meeting I'd been excluded from. My lawyer, retained quietly 6 weeks ago when the patterns became undeniable, had copies of everything. The beauty of Washington state law was its strong protections for intellectual property, especially when developed partially on personal time. 8:33, 8:32, 8:31. I stood up, stretched, and walked to my kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life as I measured out beans with the same precision I'd used to architect digital fortresses. There was something calming about the analog process. Water heated to exactly 195 degrees. Beans ground to the perfect coarseness. 4 minutes of brewing time. Through my kitchen window, I could see the Neuralink Dynamics Tower in the distance, its glass facade reflecting the gray Seattle morning. Somewhere on the 42nd floor, Holden was probably in another meeting, taking credit for another innovation he didn't understand. 5:17, 5:16, 5:15. I returned to my desk with fresh coffee, black, no sugar. The terminal window continued its relentless countdown. Each second represented another line of code executing, another security protocol activating, another digital door sliding shut. They'd assumed I'd built Sentinel Nexus like every other corporate system, functional but ultimately replaceable. They'd never understood that I'd built it like a Swiss watch, with every component dependent on every other, and all of them answering to a master key that had never left my possession. 2.01, 2 balls, 1.59. Almost time. I opened a new terminal window and typed a single command, my fingers steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. This would archive a complete log of the lockdown sequence, time-stamped and encrypted. Evidence, if I needed it. Protection, if they tried to blame me for their own incompetence. 0, 30, 0.29, 0.28. I took a sip of coffee and smiled. They wanted to remove me from the equation. They just forgot to check what happened when you removed the cornerstone from an arch. The countdown reached 0 at 9:21 a.m., and I felt nothing. No surge of vindication, no thrill of revenge, just the cold satisfaction of watching a perfectly executed program run its course. I sat in my apartment, 23 floors above the Seattle streets, cradling a cup of coffee that had gone cold during the termination call. My personal laptop displayed the Orion interface, clean, minimal, designed for function over form. Green text on a black background showed the progression. Phase 1, complete. Access points secured. Phase 2, complete. Encryption keys rotated. Phase 3, complete. Biometric locks engaged. Phase 4, initiating. System-wide quarantine. I took a sip of the cold coffee, grimacing slightly at the temperature but not bothering to reheat it. There was something appropriate about drinking cold coffee while watching a corporation's digital infrastructure freeze over. My notebook lay open to today's page, in neat handwriting. I recorded July 19, 2025, 9:07 a.m. Terminated via Zoom. H. Vance, D. Mitchell, E. Crawford present. 9:11 a.m. Access revoked, contract violation, Section 14. 3. 9:21 a.m. Orion Protocol complete. The simplicity of the entries belied the complexity of what was happening 23 floors below and across the city. Every workstation attempting to access Sentinel Nexus would be hitting a wall. Every security clearance, every encrypted file, every protected communication channel, all of it now locked behind biometric requirements that only one person could fulfill. I closed the notebook and set down my pen. A Mont Blanc my father had given me when I graduated from MIT. For signing important documents, he'd said. I wondered if he'd imagined I'd use it to document corporate betrayal. My phone sat silent on the desk. By my calculation, it would take approximately 8 to 12 minutes for the first wave of panic to hit, another 5 for them to trace the lockdown to its source, and perhaps 3 more before someone thought to call me. I gave myself 20 minutes of peace. I stood and walked to my bookshelf, running my fingers along the spines. Technical manuals mixed with philosophy. Cyberpunk novels next to encryption textbooks. My hand stopped at a worn copy of The Art of War. Such a cliché for a tech professional to own. But Sun Tzu understood something that Holden Vance never would. Every battle is won before it is fought. The view from my window stretched across Elliott Bay, where ferries moved like small cities across the gray water. I'd chosen this apartment specifically for this view, for the reminder that there was a world beyond server rooms and board meetings. A world that would continue spinning regardless of whether Neuralink Dynamics could access their files this morning. I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with Dr. Sarah Kim, the former CTO who'd hired me. She'd been forced out 8 months ago, replaced by one of Holden's golf buddies who thought the cloud was a magical place where data lived freely. Watch yourself, Elena. She'd warned over drinks at a discreet bar in Capitol Hill. They don't value builders, they value extractors. I'd thought I could navigate it, that my work would speak for itself, but work only speaks to those who understand the language. And Holden's vocabulary was limited to profit margins and power plays. My laptop chimed softly. A new line appeared in the Orion interface. System status, locked authorized users. 0 time since lockdown. Wo 0. Zo 3 timer 27, 3.5 minutes. By now, The help desk phones would be ringing. Junior IT staff would be scrambling, checking connections, restarting servers, running diagnostics that would all return the same result: access denied. I returned to my desk and opened a second laptop, my truly personal machine, air-gapped and encrypted with algorithms of my own design. This one contained the master keys, the biometric profiles, the documentation that proved I'd built Sentinel Nexus not just as an employee, but as an architect whose intellectual property had been repeatedly violated. Everything was there, organized with the same precision I'd brought to system design: contract copies, email chains, Git commit histories showing late-night and weekend work done on personal equipment. My lawyer would be very interested in the folder labeled Ownership Disputes. But that would come later. For now, I sat in the eye of a storm I'd created, watching rain streak down my window while somewhere across the city, an empire built on stolen foundations was discovering what happened when you removed the architect. The coffee was cold, but I drank it anyway. Some things were worth enduring for the sake of symmetry. At 9:21 a.m., the digital avalanche began. I watched it unfold through my monitoring interface, each system reporting its status in real time. The beauty of Orion was that it didn't destroy. It preserved everything while making it completely inaccessible, like a museum suddenly encased in bulletproof glass. The first alerts came from the Seattle headquarters, terminal after terminal displaying the same message: Encrypted, awaiting verified biometric key. I imagined the scene: developers staring at screens that moments ago held their work, now reduced to digital tombstones. Project managers frantically clicking through folders that wouldn't open. Executives discovering their presentations had become hieroglyphics without a Rosetta Stone. By 9:24 a.m., the cascade had reached the satellite offices: Los Angeles, Austin, Boston, each location hitting the same wall. The Orion protocol didn't discriminate. From intern workstations to C-suite dashboards, everyone was equally locked out. Then Holden made his critical error. At 9:26 a.m., the system logged an authentication attempt using the honeypot key I'd given Ethan. The same key they'd used to prowl through my work at dawn. But now, instead of granting access, it triggered Orion's second phase. The screen flashed: simulated key detected. Access denied. System quarantined. Unauthorized access attempt logged. And then, in what I considered my masterstroke, a new message appeared across every locked terminal in the network. System architect, Elena Hartman, biometric authentication required. My name, which they'd so carefully erased from reports and presentations, now displayed on every screen in the company. Impossible to delete. Impossible to ignore. My phone, silent until now, erupted. 17 calls in 30 seconds. I let them all go to voicemail, watching the names accumulate: Marcus, Jennifer from IT, 3 unknown numbers that were probably help desk, and finally, Holden himself. I pulled up another window, accessing the internal communication system through a back door I'd left for emergencies. The company Slack was in meltdown. Urgent, all systems down. Can't access anything. Even the backup servers are locked. Where's Elena? Wait, didn't she get fired this morning? Oh shit. The last comment made me smile. Someone had connected the dots. By 9:32 a.m., they'd tried everything: password resets, system restores, even attempting to physically disconnect and reconnect servers. But Orion lived deeper than that. Embedded in the firmware like digital DNA. Every attempted fix only confirmed what I'd known from the beginning. They'd built their empire on architecture they didn't understand. The Boeing contract alone was worth $300 million. Lockheed's classified projects, another $200 million. Add in the smaller contractors, the government subcontracts, the international partners, all of them depending on Sentinel Nexus for secure communication and data storage. All of them, at this moment, calling Neuralink Dynamics to ask why their systems were displaying my name instead of functioning properly. I opened my email, my personal one, and found a message from Dr. Sarah Kim. Watching the news. Beautiful work. Call me when you're ready. News. I opened a browser and checked the tech sites. Nothing yet, but it wouldn't be long. A security failure of this magnitude couldn't be hidden. Stock prices would react. Board members would demand answers. And Holden would have to explain how he'd managed to lock himself out of his own castle. The panic was spreading beyond IT now. I could track it through the authentication attempts, HR trying to access personnel files, legal attempting to retrieve contracts, finance discovering they couldn't process morning transactions. Each failed attempt generated a log entry, and each log entry added to the digital trail leading back to that 5:23 a.m. unauthorized access. My notebook lay open, and I added a new entry. 9:35 a.m., full system quarantine, achieved estimated downtime cost, 2.3 minutes per hour, authentication attempts, 1,847, in climbing status, operational as designed. The infrastructure I'd spent 4 years building was performing exactly as specified. Every security protocol I'd implemented was working flawlessly. The only problem was that the people who'd claimed credit for it had never bothered to understand how it worked. I stood and stretched, feeling the tension of the morning finally settling into my shoulders. 3 floors below. Mrs. Patterson was probably starting her morning yoga routine. 5 blocks away, the Pike Place market was filling with tourists. The world continued its rhythm, oblivious to the digital earthquake emanating from the Neuralink Dynamics Tower. My phone buzzed again, this time, a text from an unknown number. Elena, this is Holden. We need to talk. Urgently. I deleted it without responding and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. They'd allocated 4 minutes to end my career. I could spare a few hours to watch theirs burn. The call came at 11:50 a.m. I'd been expecting it sooner, but pride is a powerful delayer of inevitable surrenders. Elena. Holden's voice had lost its morning smugness, replaced by something that might have been humility if he were capable of it. I think perhaps we started off on the wrong foot this morning. I let silence fill the space where desperation lived. Outside my window, a seaplane lifted off from Lake Union, its pontoons catching the brief break in the clouds. Freedom in motion. Are you there? His voice cracked slightly. I'm here. My tone was neutral as distilled water. Look, I've been thinking, maybe we were too hasty. Your contributions to the company have been significant. The words seemed to physically pain him. Perhaps we could discuss a consulting arrangement, a senior advisory role. Interesting timing, I said, taking a sip of my 3rd coffee of the day. What prompted this sudden recognition of my value? I could hear him grinding his teeth through the phone. Behind him, muffled voices argued, board members, probably, or major clients demanding answers he couldn't provide. Elena, let's be professional about this. The systems need to be restored. Our clients, your clients, I corrected. I was terminated at 9:07 this morning, remember? Effective immediately, no notice period, access revoked within the hour. Your exact words were, you're no longer with us. That was premature. We could work something out. A generous severance package, ongoing consulting fees. Name your price. I smiled at his assumption that this was about money. Have you reviewed my employment contract recently? Holden, specifically, Section 96? Silence. The man who'd claimed to revolutionize our operations had never read the fundamental documents. Allow me to refresh your memory, I continued, opening my laptop to the document I'd reviewed countless times. Section 96, Intellectual Property Rights. In the event of termination without the contractually mandated 30-day notice period, all intellectual property developed by the employee, including but not limited to system architectures, security protocols, and encryption keys, remains the sole property of the employee. That can't be enforceable. Your legal department seemed to think it was when they drafted it. I simply negotiated for that clause when I recognized the unique nature of my contributions. Dr. Kim supported it. You never bothered to review it when you took over. I heard papers rustling, urgent whispers. Someone had finally thought to check the contract. Furthermore, I added, every action taken this morning has been logged and documented, including the unauthorized access to Sentinel Nexus at 5:23 a.m. using a compromised administrator key from your home IP address. Without biometric authentication, that's a federal crime under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. By the way, you set us up? His voice was barely controlled fury. I protected my work. You attempted to steal it. The setup was entirely your own. More arguing in the background. I caught fragments. Stock price. Boeing is threatening. Emergency board meeting. What do you want? He finally asked the question that mattered. I want nothing from you. Holden. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the intellectual property transfer and the contract violations. I suggest you focus on explaining to your board how you managed to lock your company out of its own infrastructure while attempting to steal credit for work you didn't understand. Elena, please. Oh, and Holden, you might want to check Section 97 as well. The non-compete clause is void if the company violates any terms of the employment agreement. I'll be free to offer my services to your competitors immediately. You can't. I can. I did. And unlike you, I understand exactly how everything works. I paused, letting the weight of the situation fully settle. Next time, try building something you actually understand. I ended the call before he could respond. My phone immediately lit up with more calls, but I switched it to silent. The point had been made. My laptop showed the ongoing chaos. 7,413 failed authentication attempts and counting. The estimated downtime cost had risen to $11.5 million. 3 major clients had already issued breach of contract notices. I closed the laptop and picked up my father's Mont Blanc pen. In my notebook, I made one final entry for the morning. 11:58 a.m. Contact established and terminated legal proceedings to commence system remains secure. Architect status, irreplaceable. The rain had stopped, and Seattle's rare sunshine broke through the clouds. Somewhere in the Neuralink Dynamics Tower, executives were scrambling to explain the unexplainable. But here, in my apartment, surrounded by the quiet certainty of well-executed code, everything was exactly as it should be. The silence that followed was absolute. I set my phone face down on the desk, watching the darkened screen reflect the Seattle skyline. No more calls to ignore. No more desperate negotiations. Just the quiet aftermath of a perfectly executed endgame. I walked to my window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. 23 floors below. The city moved in its endless rhythm. Buses navigating traffic, pedestrians clutching coffee cups. Life continuing unaware of the digital catastrophe unfolding in the tower I could see in the distance. The Orion interface on my laptop pulsed steadily. System status. Locked duration. 02.4733. Estimated impact. 14.7 nurs. And climbing. I closed the laptop with a soft click. The numbers would continue climbing without my observation. Every minute, every hour. The cost of their hubris compounding like interest on a debt they never knew they'd incurred. My leather notebook lay open to the final entry. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen one last time, feeling its familiar weight. But there was nothing left to document. No more betrayals to record, no more contingencies to plan. The story had reached its conclusion. I closed the notebook and slipped it into my bag, along with the laptop containing the master keys. These would go to my lawyer's office this afternoon, evidence for the legal proceedings that would undoubtedly follow. But that was tomorrow's battle. Today's was already won. In my kitchen. I poured the cold coffee down the sink and rinsed the mug carefully. Such mundane actions felt almost sacred after the morning's digital warfare. I dried the mug and placed it back in the cabinet, aligned perfectly with the others. My apartment felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of unspoken grievances had finally been lifted. For months, I'd carried the burden of watching my work stolen, my contributions erased, my expertise dismissed. Now, That weight had been transferred to the shoulders where it belonged. I gathered my things methodically: bag, keys, coat against Seattle's unpredictable weather. At the door, I paused, looking back at the space where I'd orchestrated the downfall of a corporate empire. It looked remarkably ordinary, just an apartment with a good view and expensive coffee maker. The hallway was empty as I made my way to the elevator. Mrs. Patterson emerged from 2301, yoga mat under her arm. "Good morning, Elena. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, meaning it more than she could possibly know. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying me away from the morning's battlefield. In the lobby, the doorman nodded his usual greeting, unaware he was watching the exit of someone who'd just locked down $750 million in digital infrastructure. Outside, Seattle had transformed. The morning's rain had given way to unexpected sunshine, turning the wet streets into mirrors reflecting the sky. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing deeply, tasting freedom in the air. My phone buzzed once more, a message from Dr. Sarah Kim. "Lunch at 1, the usual place." "My treat." I smiled and typed back, "See you there." As I walked toward the parking garage, I didn't look back at the Neuralink Dynamics tower. There was no need. Somewhere behind those glass walls, Holden Vance was learning the hardest lesson of his MBA-fueled career. Competence can be hired, but comprehension must be earned. They thought they were removing a replaceable component from their machine. They forgot to check if that component was actually the engine. The Sentinel Nexus remained locked, awaiting biometric authentication from the only person who truly understood its architecture. It would wait as long as necessary, patient as a digital sphinx guarding secrets worth hundreds of millions. But I wouldn't be returning to unlock it. That privilege belonged to the past, to a version of me who believed that good work would be recognized and respected. This version, the one walking through Seattle sunshine with litigation documents in her bag and freedom in her step, had different plans. The system hadn't failed. It had worked exactly as designed, protecting itself from those who would claim it without understanding it. And somewhere in the space between justice and revenge, I'd found something unexpected: peace. They'd forgotten the architect. The architecture hadn't. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate justice in the digital age. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of workplace revenge, please subscribe to the channel and share your own experiences. Have you ever witnessed someone underestimate the quiet ones? Let's discuss in the comments.